All right, and again, so this is Linda Harms Okazaki. I will let you introduce yourself in a minute. You're here to do the 1950 census and how we can use it with our genealogy. And I think you'll be talking specific or a little bit about Japanese Americans and
Absolutely.
All right, so I will hand it over to you.
Okay, great. I'm so excited to be back again. I realized last night this is the 12th in Densho's family history webinar series. So that is really exciting. I keep referring people back to it. So there may be things I talk about today that if you haven't watched a webinar, you might want to go back and watch one of the previous ones. They're all free, they're recorded. You can watch them from your bedroom or your living room or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Great.
And hang on just one second. Okay, how's that look?
Great, you look good. I'm going to mute myself and go off camera.
Sounds great. Well, welcome everybody, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for coming back to the Densho Family History webinar series. And today we are talking about the 1950 Federal Census, which was released to the public, no fooling, on April Fool's Day, April 1st of this year, 2022. So a census is a survey of a particular population. There's different sorts of censuses. There's state censuses, there are agricultural censuses, there are different countries have different sorts of censuses. But today we are talking about just the federal population census from the US. And the US Census Bureau, as we know it today, was formed in 1902. And our US Census population has been tabulated since 1790, every 10 years since 1790. And those previous earlier census documents are maintained by the National Archives and Records Administration. It's part of our Constitution to do a census tabulation every 10 years. So it's a legal thing for us. And those census records, oh, sorry about that. Those census records are released every 72 years. And you might think, oh, they're released every 72 years for privacy because that's about the average life expectancy. And that's not quite accurate. It's more of a clerical thing because the National Archives was founded in 1934. And in 1942, they acquired the census records from 1790 to 1870. But this was 1942, 72 years since the last release. So it became a clerical issue that every next 10 years, a set of census records would be released and then maintained by the National Archives. Each US federal census, decennial census, has its own set of instructions, and you can find those on the National Archives website. And each census asks different questions, and you can review those. So for example, in 1790 through 1840, only the head of household was named. Everybody else on those census records had a little tick mark, and they were grouped by age and gender and race and free or enslaved status. It wasn't until 1850 that each free household member was actually named. And they continued to morph over time. So in 1870, that's when we first see Japanese in the census. Not a lot, but we see the Wakamatsu colony, for example, in Northern California. And we see students on the East Coast, like at Rutgers or New Jersey and in Massachusetts. But those early census records, or those earliest ones with the first Japanese, did not have a racial designation for Japanese. So in 1870, 1880, Japanese immigrants were identified as Chinese unless the census enumerator went in and filled something else out. So the next census was 1890. And this is sort of special because it doesn't exist, or it only exists in very small fragments. There was a fire at the Department of Commerce in 1921. It destroyed most of the 1890 census. And that 1890 census was the first one that actually had the racial category of Japanese. As we take a deeper dive into this, I want you to take the information on each census record just with a grain of salt, because things might have been misremembered. So for example, an immigrant may have misremembered his or her year of immigration. Or in 1900, 1910, women were asked how many children they had and how many were living. This could be a really complicated question. Maybe they were divorced, maybe they had several stillbirths, maybe they had adoptions. And so you don't always get an accurate piece of information. Sometimes you do, or most of the time you do, but you don't always. And then as a reader, we don't know who actually supplied the data. So was it the next door neighbor? Was it the head of household? Maybe it was the 10-year-old child. So in the 1940 census, that's the first time that we see an identification of the person who actually gave the information. And then you can determine if you think the accuracy is pretty good. So why is the 1950 census so important? Well, for many of us, not me, but for many of us, it might be the first time you see yourself in the census, or maybe it's the first time you see your parents in the census. But for Nikkei in the US, the 1950 census really helps to fill in the blanks, especially for those who were incarcerated during World War II. So we can order their evacuee case files from the National Archives, or we can order their alien enemy case files from the National Archives, or we can look at the final accountability roster. And from there, we can determine where those people were released. Did they go to Minnesota? Did they go to Chicago? Did they go back to the town where they used to live in? Did they go to a university? Did they join the military? Were they repatriots or renunciates? So that little bit of information in 1943 to 46 or so, whenever they were actually released from incarceration, we have that information, but where did they go next? Where did they stay? The 1950 census encompasses the continental US, but it also encompasses territories like Alaska, Hawaii, American Samoa, the Canal Zone, Guam, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and then a few other islands in the Pacific. Because it was conducted shortly after World War II, there were a large number of military personnel and government employees living all around the world. So enumerators were the people who collected the information. They would go to the home and they would tabulate the information on these big sheets of paper. And there were several different forms. So form P1, that's the census population for the mainland. And it's most relevant to genealogists. And it consists of up to 30 names on the front side. And then the back side was about the housing. But when the census forms were microfilmed in 1952, the housing side was not filmed, and that information is no longer extant. The data that was collected pertained to April 1st, 1950. Now, that doesn't mean that it was collected on that day, but if the census enumerator was asking a question, he or she was referring to that date. So for example, if you had a child that was born on April 15th of 1950, theoretically, that child should not be on this form. There's always exceptions, but those were the instructions. And these enumerators collected data in districts, and we call those enumeration districts. That was the area that a particular census taker could cover during one census period. So it was about 2 weeks for urban areas and about 4 weeks for rural areas. And don't worry, I am going to show you magnified images. It Form P1, that was the form for people living in the continental US. And it had 30 slots for people to be listed. Sometimes they didn't fill it all the way up. And on the bottom were sample questions for 6 individuals that were listed on the upper part. And the kinds of questions were about the address, the employment, was it a farm, was it how the person was related to the head of household, race, sex, age on last birthday, marital status, state or country of birth, and citizenship status. The one that really jumps out at me for this is the race category. And we have to go back to the enumerator instructions, which designated that W was for white, NEG for Negro, IND for American Indian, CHI for Chinese, and JAP for Japanese, as well as FIL for Filipino. Now, the instructions went on to say that if there was another category, race was to be fully written in. And sometimes that was up to the enumerator to say that. Mexicans were to be designated as white unless they were obviously, from the perception of the enumerator, another race. And mixed Black and white or Black and Native individuals were presumed to be Black or Negro, unless they said that Indian blood predominates. Again, that was probably up to the enumerator to make that decision. Where it gets complicated and where it relates to us today has to do with mixed Asians. So there was no way to describe a mixed Asian, although sometimes you will see it written in. And if you find examples of this, I'd love to hear back from you to see how the enumerator maybe didn't follow instructions. So technically, mixed races were supposed to be defined by the race of the father. So if the father was white and the mother was Japanese, the child should theoretically be described as white. Likewise, if the father was Japanese and the mother was white or something else, the child would be designated as Japanese. So there were questions for people 14 years of age and over, mostly pertaining to work, occupation, how much money they made. And then the sample questions were for those 6 individuals who were randomly designated on the page. Were they living in the same house a year ago? Was he living on a farm? Was he living in the same country? What's the highest grade of school that he attended? Did he finish the school? And so on. And then for those individuals who were on the sample lines, who were over age 14, or 14 years of age and over, they had some additional questions, like how many weeks had they been looking for work, mostly pertaining to wages and salaries. But there was a question that kind of irks me, but if male, did he ever serve in the US Armed Forces during World War I, World War II, or any other time, including the present service? You notice they didn't ask if a woman was serving. They only asked this question for men. And then on these simple questions, the very last person had some additional questions. So if the person worked last year, you enter that, and what kind of work and what kind of business. And then if married, if ever married, has this person been married more than once? How many years since this person was last married? And then they ask if female and ever married, widowed, divorced, or separated, how many children has she ever born, not counting stillbirths? And again, this question gets complicated for a woman who, maybe she had children before she was married. And how does she answer that question? So this is the basic form for continental US. There was an additional card called an infant card, and this was specified to be completed for every child born in the first 3 months of 1950. But they are no longer extant records. You can go to the National Archives website or the Census Bureau and look at the questions. But if your family member or research subject was born in the first 3 months, they are not going to be noted on it. You won't be able to find an infant card. There was also an overseas census report, and it was collected, but those records are no longer extant. And this is Form P5. And what this really means to our population is that if your US civilian or US military person was living overseas, you will not find them in the 1950 census. There are census schedules that are on microfilm for military personnel in some of the territories, but not for people living, say, in Japan, maybe on a military base on Japan. Form P87. I know we have people in the audience today whose ancestors lived in Hawaii. Maybe your family still lives in Hawaii. And these questions were very similar to those asked on the continental US, but there were a few differences. Both forms had space for 30 people. They included questions asked of individual 6 people that were on sample questions, but it asked things like the island and the county. So Maui, the type of housing, a hotel, a large rooming house, an institution, or a military installation. The race options were slightly different. So there was an option of Hawaiian, Puerto Rican, plus a question if they were mixed race. And in that situation, the enumerator was instructed to complete, to describe the mixed race. Under the citizenship question, there was an option for territorial citizenship because Hawaii wasn't a state at this point. So if they were a citizen of the territory of Hawaii, that would be included. Most of the rest of the questions were pretty similar until you get to the sample questions on the bottom. And that's where they asked about where this person was on VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. Most of us think of VJ Day as being several days or lengthy period of time, but for this particular census, it referenced the 14th of August, 1945. Now, some of you, like in my family and some of my clients, you might have had people that were living in a hotel or a campground or a trailer park. So there were 2 nights designated as T nights, a Tuesday night and a Thursday night. These were April 11th and April 13th. And the idea was to enumerate the transient populations, people without regular addresses, individuals living in hotels, trailer parks, campgrounds, missions, flop houses, that sort of thing. And the first night was for hotels and campgrounds and such. And the second night was supposed to be for places like missions and flop houses. And the data was collected and then added to the standard P1 form. I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. So for those of you who have relatives, say, for example, living in single room occupancy accommodations in Little Tokyo of LA or Japantown in San Francisco or the International District of Seattle, you might find something like this. It'd be interesting information for you. So where are you going to look for the 1950 census? How are you going to search for your family? What happens if you can't find somebody by name, and this will happen to you? And what are enumeration district maps? So the 1950 census was digitized by NARA, National Archives and Record Administration, and they name indexed it using artificial intelligence with optical character recognition. This is the first time this has been done for the census. Humans have then gone in and enhanced that computer-generated name index. So if it said Okawaki, I could go in and change it to Okazaki. Ancestry and Family Search have also worked together to improve upon the indexing. It might not be perfect, but I actually think it's pretty good, especially comparing it to the 1940 census. They start out with optical character recognition, artificial intelligence, and enhance it with people. When you begin your search, I would suggest you start with a name search for your people of interest, and there's different places you can do this. Sometimes you have to look everywhere because what might be indexed on one site might not be indexed on another. So the places that I know of that you can search for the 1950 census would be National Archives, Family Search, Ancestry.com, and MyHeritage. Now, Ancestry and MyHeritage are subscription sites, but you can register as a guest, and at least with Ancestry, you can usually access this at your local public library. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to buy a subscription. If you still can't find somebody, start thinking creatively. Where did they live? If you don't know where they lived, how might you use your other documentary evidence to try and figure out where they lived? Can you look at a naturalization record or a city directory? Now, I mentioned that enumeration districts are the areas that can be covered by an enumerator during a single census period. These districts are mapped and they're available on the National Archives website, probably other places, but that's where usually I go, is the National Archives website for these maps. So if you have an idea where they lived, you can try using the enumeration district maps, browse through those, narrow down their location, and then maybe you can find them that way. I will walk you through that. So this is the National Archives catalog. what I've done is I've clicked catalog and I've come into this page and I've typed into the search box, just for example, Enumeration District Maps, Seattle, 1950. And I can hone in on a whole map of Seattle and then narrow it down to a much closer area of a neighborhood that I'm trying to search. So let's go to the National Archives search engine for 1950. It's 1950 census.archives.gov, or you can Google it. Google is your friend with these things. There is a search box and there is a resources box. Resources, if you want to know more about how to search the National Archives 1950 census, utilize this resource. But for now, we're going to begin our search. And when I click that, I get this page, which gives me the option to add in a state, county, city, a name, first name, and or last name. So for example, if I only know that I'm looking for Caitlin in Seattle, I'll just search that for starters. I might get a lot of hits, but you have options for how you search. Also, add in names with creative spelling. That can sometimes help you. And I can also type in the enumeration district number if I have found that. And I'm going to walk you through how to do that. So for those of you who've been watching this series of webinars, you've already met this Kinoshita family. And for those of you that are new, I want to introduce you to them. So the gentleman on the far left who's seated, that is Fred Suekichi Kinoshita. He's the father. Seated opposite from him is his wife, Anna Akino. And then in between, standing and sitting, are their 6 children: Imelda, May, sometimes called Mary, Ish, Chuck, Mary Jane, and Baco, or Francis. Now, we know from our previous webinars that Baco passed away serving his country in the 442nd during World War II. So obviously, we are not going to find him in the 1950 census. We also know from our previous research that Fred and Anna and their 2 youngest children were the first Japanese American family to return to Seattle during resettlement. But if I can't find them by the name index, I can go start with this enumeration district map of Seattle. And you can see it's pretty big. Seattle's a pretty big city, but I can narrow it down because I already know that the Kinoshita family, for some of that resettlement time, was living on 18th. And as I narrow it down, I find that they were actually living on 18th between Jefferson and Alder. And that is within the city of Seattle, Enumeration District 474. So then I search for Kinoshita. I'm going to look on the National Archives website. If I can't find it there, maybe Family Search or Ancestry or MyHeritage. And in fact, I do get this big crazy page, which I know you can't read, so let me blow this up for you. We've got Fred and Anna and their 2 children, Mary and Charles, who went by Chuck. We see that Fred is a janitor working in a private school, which is really consistent with the other records that we've already looked at. And we also see that Anna is on line 4, and that circle on line 4 tells us that she was on a sample question. So it says on the sample question that she'd previously, the year before, she was living at this address. Her parents were both born in Japan. We already know that. It says she has 0 years of education. We know from her evacuee case files, however, that she went to high school in Japan. So this is a situation where you want to take this with a grain of salt. But what next? There are 3 other daughters that are not named. We know a little bit about them, right? So we have to think about, was this a problem of poor transcription? Were they married already? Were they living overseas? So think creatively. We know through the evacuee case files that Imelda left Minidoka on the 20th of March, 1943 for Chicago. Irene Ishiko, who went by Ish, left camp on the 20th of October, 1943, and she went to nursing school in Chicago. And Mary Jane Kajiko, she went to Minnesota on a scholarship to a Catholic university. So how can we fill in the blanks? They were not in Chicago or Minnesota, so I have to start being creative. And what I found was that if I typed in that first name, Imelda, for example, in Seattle, then I found her. I found that she was married to Henry Kiga. They had 2 children, Andrew and Charlotte. Henry was noted on there, and he was also included on the sample lines. And I found out he worked for the US Post Office. Mary Jane, she was married to Joseph Hashisaki, and they also had children, Geraldine and Peter. So now I know that both of these women married sometime during the resettlement period. So that gives me enough information to go and look for their marriage records. But what about Irene? Using the same process, I found that Irene Tanabe was married and working as a registered nurse. So I know this has to be her because she's a registered nurse. The first name fits, the race fits, the age fits. Her spouse, however, was not enumerated with her. So I have to think, where was he? Was he in the military? Was he working as a civil servant overseas? Pay attention to the really hard to read notations. So by scrolling down to the bottom of the page, or maybe halfway down the page, I see that he was transcribed Tanabe George. He wasn't living in Seattle, but his occupation was that of sexing baby chicks. So those of you who are not part of the Japanese American community might not be familiar with this occupation. Might even sound a little odd to you, but it was a known occupation, and it was very prominent among the Japanese Americans who had been released and were resettling for a time in Chicago. And they determined the gender of the baby chicks. Females were more desirable because they laid all the eggs. And so you might find out, wow, my relative was a chicken sexer in Chicago. Who knew? Think about other occupations. So was your family member one of the first to go to New Jersey? And if they went to New Jersey during resettlement, did they work at Seabrook Farms, the frozen food plant? And take it a step further. So if you find Seabrook Farms in New Jersey and you find your person, look at everyone else on the census page. In fact, I would recommend that you go a page prior and a page after. Who else was working at Seabrook Farms frozen food plant? Look at the friends, the associates, the neighbors. Were they all working in the same occupation? Might they have been incarcerated together? Might they have all come from the same location prior to World War II? Were they all released together from camp to go there? Were they from Peru? Were these Japanese Peruvians? Lots of questions to ask just by looking at more than your own relative. And my clicker is not going, so hang on one sec. There we go. Let's talk a minute about Hawaii. So I already said that the territory of Hawaii had its own form, P87, pretty much the same as the mainland, but they did ask about VJ Day. And on this example, we can see that the second from the bottom was an infant. It said born on VJ Day. So maybe you didn't know that. That gives you a little bit more information about your family. So here's an example from my own family. Jordan F. Hidatsuka was the head of the family, and he was married to Maruko O. Hidatsuka. And Jordan's brother-in-law, Masashi Okazaki, he's the only Okazaki from this family living in the US at this time, except for his sister, who no longer used the surname of Okazaki. Their brother and their parents are nowhere to be found in the 1950 census. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them at the end, but I want you to start thinking creatively. Where were they and why could I not find them? And here we have Raymond Hiroshi Hirai. Some of you have heard me talk about Raymond previously. He was incarcerated at Manzanar and then Moab, and then Santa Fe. And we know that Raymond Hirai lived most of his adult life, both pre-war and post-war, in single-room occupancy housing in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. And in fact, he was enumerated on a tea night. He was living at the Nikko Hotel at this particular time. And also on this page, we see that the Brown Hotel and the Fedora Hotel were also enumerated. And there he is. He's a lodger. He's from Japan, and he's working as a domestic in private homes. And he also has some information on the sample questions. Now, as Caitlin and I were talking about at the beginning, you are going to run into some difficulty finding some people. It's just the nature of the beast. And it's really not because they have a Japanese surname. It's just sometimes the artificial intelligence didn't quite catch it. So I know that Caitlin has a handout of information, but I did not include stevemorse.org, and I'm going to show you that website in just a second. So start thinking creatively, ask yourself the questions. Was the person a college student and therefore enumerated at a university? Was your person of interest a renunciate or a repatriate who hadn't returned to the US? Was your person of interest in the military or hospitalized or institutionalized? So think creatively. And if you really need some additional help, I recommend stevemorse.org. He has a wonderful array of resources, not just for the 1950 census, but if you need help with the 1950 census, go to his search box and you can find all of these categories for understanding the 1950 and other census records. So I'm going to go to his Unified 1950 Census ED Finder, ED being Enumeration District. And here what I can do is type in the state, the county, the city, and the street address. And if I do that, all those numbers in blue on the bottom, those are all of the corresponding ED numbers for Cook County, Chicago, which have Ainsley West as the street. I probably want to narrow it down a little bit further. And I happen to know that this woman named Mitoyo Fujii cannot be found in the NARA website. I couldn't find her in Family Search, and let's just pretend I don't have access to Ancestry or MyHeritage. I do know that she lived in Chicago at least in 1954. She was released there after the war. She was living there in 1954 because her naturalization record gives her address as being at 2854 West Ainsley in Chicago. So I'm going to start with that, but I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to go to a map of Chicago and find out what the cross streets are, and then I can narrow down these enumeration districts. And what I find, in fact, is Mitoyo Fujii enumerated. Her enumeration district was 103-633 on page 6. That's pretty cool. So I've got her now, but I want to take it a step further than this. I'm going to go back to the National Archives. I'm going to type in 1950 census.archives.gov. Go to the search box and type in what I just learned about Mitoyo Fujii. And I'm going to type in Chicago, Cook County. I'm not going to type in her name because I already know her name is not indexed correctly. But I can type in the enumeration district, and then I can pull it up. There are only 37 pages for me to look at right now, but I can go even further. I can go to the enumeration district maps here, and I can actually download them. And I still want to take it one step further, and this is where I want your help. You can do similar things on Ancestry, on Family Search. You can help transcribe the name. So if you know her name was Mitoyo Fujii, then go in and transcribe the name in there, or do it on Ancestry, wherever. Help with the crowdsourcing of making the indexing better. It's good, but it's not perfect. We still need that human touch. So I encourage you to do that. So let's go back to our favorite family. You know how to search. You know how to get your enumeration district maps. You see all kinds of information about your family, and it all ties into your family history, your family story. So what are the next steps? I'm going to pull up that Kinoshita family page, the P1, page 74, and I'm going to do something with it. I am going to download it. If you can't remember this part, go back to the webinar on organizing your family history. You want to download your images and save them in two places. Save them on your hard drive and save them in the cloud. Then I want you to label those images. You can pick your own naming convention for documents. For example, you might want to call this 1950 US Federal Census Kinoshita family, Seattle. That's good for your label. Then I want you to write about it. You write a little bit of a story isn't the right word, but a narrative. What are you looking at? Do you know about this family? Mary was working as a typist, and Akino was not working, and Fred was working as a janitor. Write that up in a little paragraph, and I guarantee if you write up a little bit about each document that you collect, that you've downloaded, that you've labeled, your family history is actually going to write itself. It makes it so much easier. And the last thing I want you to do with this document is I want you to create a citation. And I know some of you are probably thinking, oh, wow, that sounds like, high school history class or my college classes. I had to write footnotes or whatever. There is a method to the madness, because what happens if you can't, you want your kids to be able to know where you got this document, or maybe you're writing a book. You want to be able to go back and find that document. A URL is great. You can create a hyperlink, but that's not permanent. Go ahead and write and copy that hyperlink, but also write down where you got this document. You might think right now it's not worth it, but trust me, in the long run, you'll be really happy if you do this. So let's look at our family page again, the Kinoshita family. I find them in the census. I download it. I save it in my hard drive. I save it in the cloud. I label it, I write a paragraph, and now I'm ready to write my citation. So let's look at the top part. What is this? It's the 1950 census. It's Enumeration District 40-474 for Seattle, King County, Washington. And it's page 74 or sheet 74. You can also add in other information. It was enumerated on the 27th of April. And then what lines are they on? What house number was that? So this is how I might do a citation. You can do your own however you want, but I want to know what it is I'm looking at, where it came from, what the specifics are about where it came from, what page it's on, either the dwelling number or the house number, the dwelling being the order in which it was, the data was collected. Who am I talking about? And I like to add in lines 3 through 6, Fred Kinoshita family, but you could just say Fred Kinoshita if that's what you want. And where did I get this from? The National Archives, the US National Archives 1950 census. If I got it on Ancestry, I might say Ancestry. If I got it on Family Search, I might say Family Search. And then if I want, I might put in a URL. Now, this is not a full URL because I didn't have enough space on the page. If I wanted to do the hyperlink, I would use it just for my research notes. I wouldn't include it in the long run. And what does it turn out to look like? This, it's a sentence. 1950 US Federal Census, Seattle, King County, Washington, population schedule, ED 474, sheet 74, dwelling 152, lines 3 to 6, Fred Kinoshita family, and so on. So that is how I'm going to get my census records for everybody in my family. But I know some of you are probably saying, oh, I can't remember all this, I'm stuck. So where can you look for resources? I want you to be able to walk away today not knowing everything about the census, but knowing where to look. You should have a pocket full of resources. I don't want you to walk away saying, I have no idea what to do or can't find it. So usually when I recommend sources, I'll start with the Family Search Wiki, but in this situation, I'm going to start with the National Archives because it is so robust with information. There are instructional videos, tutorials, the History Hub, Enumeration District maps, all kinds of things. All you have to do is put 1950 census into the search box and you will come up with all kinds of help. There are even hyperlinks to the 1950 census, external resources, and this is where you can find all kinds of information about the Steve Morse website that I told you about. Within all this information on the National Archives website is a blog from the History Hub. So the History Hub is sort of a crowdsourced, community managed place on the National Archives website. And there's a whole series of blog posts. I think there's, I don't know, like 70 or so blog posts dedicated just to the 1950 census. So if you have a question about the 1950 census, probably it's already been answered in the History Hub's blog posts on the 1950 census. You can take it another step further by looking at the instructions. If you want to understand more about why an enumerator wrote something a certain way or didn't write something a certain way, go to the instructions. Again, these are on the National Archives website and not just for the 1950 census. They're available for all kinds of other censuses as well. If you want to keep going with assistance, I would recommend the 12 Key. It's a blog by Claire Kluskens, who is a senior digital projects archivist at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Her blog is great for all kinds of things pertaining to United States archival records. So not just the 1950 census, but there is quite a bit of information there on the 1950 census. A little tooting of my own horn, the Nichibei Weekly has a column that comes out bi-monthly, and there is an article on finding your 1950 roots. And of course, Family Search has all kinds of information. And I love where it says indexed by computers, reviewed by people. We use the computers, but we also need that human touch to come in and fix those names. Amy Johnson Crow has an entire series of YouTube videos to help you navigate the 1950 census. It's really easy to follow and super fun. She's a great presenter. She has other tips and tricks for genealogy as well, but the 1950 census videos are absolutely fabulous. And I can't not include Cindy's list because she is the go-to free source of hyperlinks for anything to do with genealogy, and her links on the 1950 census category are very robust. So as we wrap it up, I want to introduce you to T. This photo was taken about 1950. He was a renunciate. He went to Japan with his parents and his brother Masashi, who we met earlier. He worked for the US government in Japan until 2001. So he is not enumerated in the 1950 census. Sometimes the absence of a record, in this case, the absence of him being in the 1950 census, tells us just as much as the document itself. So pay attention to why you can't find somebody in the 1950 census, because that will help you to tell your full family history. And at that point, I'm going to stop sharing and take questions.
Great, thank you, Linda. As usual, I've learned a lot, more than I had known about the 1950 census, actually.
Good.
So yes, everybody feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. We have one question right now, which I will read from Gerald. Did the military keep records that are available for Nisei in Japan, either as active duty or transition to civil service?
So I think that what Gerald is asking is about US citizens serving in the military, so that Japanese citizens serving in Japan is a different, whole different topic. But yes, what I would highly recommend is that you go to the Densho webinar on military records. I did that with Jonathan Dice, and it has all kinds of information on how do you get your person's military records when they were serving in Japan, maybe in the MIS or something. Now, my father-in-law was in the civil service, and so he had a personnel file that was available. And then he was also a renunciate. So we're looking at what kind of paperwork is involved in getting his citizenship back. Wasn't a lot, but you go through the State Department for those records. But if you're specifically looking at the military records, those are going to be from the National Archives, and watch that webinar because it tells you exactly how the steps to take.
Yeah, and I think Micah or Sarah put the link to the direct link to the densho.org page that has links to those webinars. So
Great.
you should be able to easily find that. I know someone has their hand raised, but since this is a webinar, I don't believe I can call on anybody. So if you have your hand raised, you may want to just type your question into the chat. Yeah, so I mean, I guess on my end, I've noticed that over the course of, the last many months since April when it came out, occasionally I'll go back in and research, and as you were talking about with people going in and citizens going in and helping with the transcription, it's definitely improved. So since April, I have started to be able to find my different relatives in the 1950 census.
So I have a question for you. Have you gone in on the one? Have you gone in and found anybody that's not name indexed and tried to type it in?
Let's see. Well, so originally I couldn't find my grandmother on my mom's side. So this is non-Japanese American. So her name was Loretta Moore. And in April, search as I might, one would think that wouldn't be hard to find. And actually it has helped because since you have linked to like the actual enumeration district maps and things like that, that would have helped to have had back in April. I didn't go that deep in my research. If I had, because I had a general idea of where they live, so I could have done like a page by page on a much smaller scale. Because the other problem is living in Seattle, it's a large city, especially
it's a very large city with a lot of census pages.
Yeah, so I can't really can't just go through one by one. But now if I go in, I think it's Ancestry, I can key in her actual name now and pull up her page.
We got a great question I see. Do you want to read that one?
Yeah, did Repatriots and Renunciants lose US citizenship?
So yes and no. I just did a presentation on this last week, and it's very interesting. So I'll give the example of Tule Lake segregants who said, for whatever reason, whether they were coerced or they were angry or whatever, they said, I'm renunciating my US citizenship. And so for a short period of time, they did. And for those renunciates and repatriates who did not go to Japan, many of them were initially helped by Wayne Collins. And some of them have affidavits at the National Archives in San Francisco. But technically, after a few years, it was ruled that for many of these people, they were under duress, and therefore their citizenship would be automatically reinstated. Where it gets a little more complicated has to do with renunciates and repatriates who actually went to Japan. And so even though technically they got their citizenship back, they did have to go through some paperwork. And I'll give you an example. My father-in-law renunciated. He went with his parents. He'd only been in Japan once before, but he renunciated. He ends up in Japan. He goes to the US consulate in Kobe. He applies to be registered as an American citizen living temporarily abroad. And then when he's ready to come to the US, he sends in a passport application. Again, this was done in Kobe for him. It could have been someplace else for someone else. And those applications are held by the State Department. So if anybody needs more information on that, they can email me, and maybe Micah or Sarah could put my email in the chat.
Yes, and San Bruno is the San Francisco NARA branch. There's so many little cities in the Bay Area that it can be a little confusing, but yes, San Bruno is the same as the San Francisco NARA. Gordon has a question. Is the census supposed to record each person's legal name? By looking at a census, I discovered that my uncle Masaru went by the name Jimmy.
No, it's whatever the person said. If the enumerator came there and said, "What's your name?" then the person said, "My name is Jimmy," then that's what goes on. I'm going to take that a step further. A lot of times Japanese used nicknames, and that might be an issei or a nisei. And those nicknames may or may not have been legal changes. So in the case of Fred and Anna, who we saw earlier, when they became naturalized citizens, they added their Western names, and that process made those names legal. But of course, Japanese couldn't become citizens until 52. So the Fred S. Kinoshita on that census was not his legal name. He had not gone through the steps to legally change his name until he became naturalized.
Yeah, and I just recently found my grandmother had apparently written a journal of her life before the war in Colorado, and I always knew her as Mary Shizuko Oye, and we figured out the origination of the name Mary, and I don't believe she was ever legally. I don't think she ever legally changed her name to Mary. So a lot of that, with the Japanese American, and she was an American born citizen. So let's see. Diane is next on our list. How would you search for a child who passed away prior to 1950? I found records of the parents and the children who were alive when they went to camp, but cannot find records of the son who passed away prior to the war.
That's a great question. It's nothing to do with the 1950 census, but I'm happy to answer it. Part of it depends on when and where the person died. So typically you'll look for death records in the county where the death occurred. And some states and some counties have death indices, so you can look through those online to see if the person is noted in a death index. Other times you just have to go to the county level. So I'm in California. There is a California death index for certain years. So if my person is there, let's just say died in San Francisco, then I'll go down to the county office in San Francisco and get my death certificate there. So you have to do a little bit of sleuthing. It's easiest if you can narrow down the year range of when the child died. And then if you narrow down that year range, then you have an idea of where the people lived.
All right. Julie has a question. Hi, Julie. Is there a way to know which member of the family provided the info to the enumerator?
I will be completely honest here. I have no idea. It is not something I looked at. I know for the 1940 census, there's a circle with an X through it, and that's the person that reported it. If someone is in the audience who knows that, feel free to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, I will look into this, and then we will get back to you on that. But great question. Thank you.
And that's you specifically don't know for the 1950 census, right?
I personally don't know.
Yeah, and previous to that, like previous censuses, it's like the Wild West. Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Yeah. Next question. Is there anywhere where we can learn more about how the AI text recognition works and how we might replicate it?
So I don't know how to answer that. I know Micah's going to answer it, but I would probably go to the History Hub on the National Archives website, and Micah might have more information on that as well.
And then from John, it says, apologies. This question is off topic. I recently discovered a paper document that appears to be a US passport for my mother, who was born in San Jose, to travel to Japan. She was 1 year old at the time. Was this a common practice?
Thanks, John. Great question. Let me first say that the whole purpose behind these webinars that we're doing for Densho is for people to learn. So I don't really consider this off topic because it's genealogy and I love this kind of thing. So John, I don't know what year she was born, but because of the laws at the time, if this was a US citizen, she clearly was born in the US, she needed to be able to get back into the country. And at certain periods of time, there were restrictions on Asian immigrants coming into the country. She was born in San Jose, so they're probably coming back into California. In one of our webinars, we talked about a fellow who had a delayed birth certificate, and the immigration authorities on Angel Island kept him there and held him by the Board of Special Inquiry because they didn't believe the authenticity of his birth certificate. So people really wanted to be able to prove that they came back in. So this is where we see a lot of delayed birth certificates. You see a ton of delayed birth certificates for Nikkei families in Hawaii, mostly like pre-war. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. The passport, he says, is 1918. So.
Oh, thank you. So yes, so there were restrictions on Asians coming in at that period of time, and then got even stricter in 1924.
Yeah. I know oftentimes with passenger manifests, I will see with my relatives their passport numbers and when they applied and where they applied.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes your alien registration numbers.
Yes, and sometimes that. We are almost 11, but I think there's just one more question from Gerald. Did the various Buddhist churches keep records that are accessible to someone in the English language?
Okay, so I am not an expert in Buddhist records, but I have actually had some experience in this. Obviously in Japan, no, those would be all in Japanese, but I have had some experience contacting Buddhist churches for posthumous records, which happen to be in English. There are a lot of other people out there that are experts in the various Buddhist denominations who would be much more able to answer the questions more robustly than I have. I will refer you to Facebook. I know people have a love-hate relationship with Facebook, but there are some great free sites out there. You know, your Japanese American, Japanese Roots, there's an Asia, Africa, something else community. So there are a lot of resources out there in the Japanese American community. I'm sure people can answer that better than I have, and I would like to know more.
Yeah, that would be good to know. I imagine it's very hit and miss. I know there's a Buddhist Churches of America collection that I think is now held at CLA, but yeah. So Thomas says family serve. Oh, it went away. Micah probably saw that.
Yeah, sorry. Thomas is letting us know that Family Services provides retrieval of Japanese Buddhist family koseki, from my experience. This is in the dismissed section.
So I will tell you that all changed with COVID. There was a Japanese missionary who worked in Salt Lake City who would assist with that. So my experience is that recently that's not been the case, but there are a lot of other places that will help with koseki retrieval. And you can go back and look at the webinar on that for koseki information.
Yeah. All right, well, that no more questions, and we are at like 11:03. So again, thank you so much, Linda, for joining us and talking about the 1950 census. And I hope everybody can go out and do a lot of digging and research. And again, this webinar has been recorded, and it takes Zoom a little while to catch up, but once it is available, usually within the next 24 hours, we'll send out an email link to it, and it will also you'll be able to access it through the Densho website, the link that was earlier in the chat. And yeah, thank you, Linda, and we will hopefully talk to you again soon.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.